Hi guys, so we are just gonna pick up where we left off last time. I was talking about doing interiors in 1 point perspective, and I chose to make a hallway extending back into the scary distance. So I worked on it for a few minutes after I concluded my last lesson, and I just want to talk for a minute about a few things that I did here. So if you were with me for the last lesson, you'll remember that I created this space just using simple 1 point perspective, and then I divided the wall up using my fence post method. And in fact, you can see the little marks here at the top of my wall. I left them just so that you would know. Then I pulled those lines down, pulled them across, and then back up. Next, I spaced things out so that I had a doorway and then two doorways in terms of my spacing, another doorway, two doorways, another doorway, so that I was able to use these measurements to give me this space. Now I did the same thing over here, but just for my composition, I decided to stagger them. So I did the same thing, 1, 2, 1, 2, etc. And you can see just how quickly things begin to compress as they move back in space. Now I used those same marks for my floor, but I divided that in half. Now, because otherwise these tiles would have been super stretched out. So in terms of how I subdivided each section, the way to do that is to actually create an X to get the center point and then run a line through that. I kind of guesstimated, but that's how we do it correctly. Next, I measured this line, and so that each of these points was equidistant, and then I brought those back to my vanishing point. Next, I went through and I decided to put a little light at the top of my ceiling. To get it in the center, I just drew a line across, measured in half, and then sent a line through there, which you can still kind of see ghosted through. I decided to space my lights out using my doorways. So I took a look at where my point was at the top right corner of each doorway, or, starting here, and then 1, 2, 3 segments, and then I went across. And I can just repeat that process going back in space. In my last lesson, I mentioned cylinders. And so with cylinders and round forms, I just need to remember that they're going to be nice ellipses. So speaking of ellipses, this is a little hard to see, but there's a little doorknob here. I have cut my doorway so that it's pushed a little bit back in space. It's subtle, but those subtle things in perspective end up making a really big difference. I've also used directional hatching just to reinforce that space. And I just did it kind of quickly. If I wasn't using a whiteboard pen, I might have even taken my time and filled some of these squares in, and actually to create this a little more accurately, I probably would have even divided these tiles one more time just to make them a little bit more foreshortened. Although, of course, if I were to be doing this drawing in a more sophisticated way, using, for instance, a mechanical pencil, that would create a lot more work. But it's fun. So I am going to get rid of this in a moment. But one thing that I want to point out is that if I were to continue working on this, I would probably add a little border at the bottom of the wall. I would add door frames. If I was going to be doing it in a more complex way, I could even put like numbers on the door, I could have people just shuffling back. And remember, if I were to add people in this, they would also relate to my vanishing point, and their size would recede in line with my vanishing point. So at some point I will talk a little bit about creating a figure using perspective, but for now we are just going to move on, and I'll erase my black doors that were red to start with. Rolling Stones would be proud. So here we go. Lessons in non-attachment. So next we're going to switch back to 2-point. I try to alternate in my lessons just to really keep reinforcing those basic concepts. And I'm going to be talking to you guys about staircases. I'm going to use 2-point to create my staircase. And once again, here we go. Back to my horizon line. And I know I say this every time, but it is very important for our horizon line to be straight and to be parallel with the edge of our picture plane. Okay, so if I'm doing 2-point, well, I need to put my points in. And once again, our points need to be as far away as we can get them. I just want to make sure you guys can see them. Okay, so because this staircase is going to be on the ground here, if I get too low, it might start to get a little bit skewed because I'm starting to get beyond this comfortable space that exists between my two vanishing points. Maybe I'll start there. Okay, so we're going to do this fast. Now, the way that I begin this is just the same as if I were making a box. And that makes sense because a staircase is basically just stacked boxes. So I think the first thing I will do is determine the length of my step. So there we go, length of my step. And then I'm going to determine the depth of my step, right? I was too lazy to go over there, but that is where this line is going. Now, I'm going to need to figure out my next step. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to take the same measurement that I have here, and I'm going to place it up there. So even though I didn't measure, that little segment should be the same, right? Okay, so okay, now I have step number 2. Okay, so the next thing that I need to do is figure out this back one. I'm actually going to use a method that I will use sometimes, and I'm hoping this doesn't confuse you guys. So you might see with this dotted line, I have indicated where the corner would be if I were to, instead of having a step and then another step, if they were just 2 even blocks stacked on top of each other, because that is going to allow me to use my fence post method. And here is where it becomes really crucial that my measurements are correct. One thing about perspective is that while it does become intuitive, the longer we do it, when there's issues of imprecision, as will naturally arise for someone who is not using a ruler, that can start to cause major problems down the road. So we're just going to hope for the best. So I'm going to take my pen and go from the corner through the center, and I'm going to hit this bottom part. And I'm just going to continue doing that. I'll try to stay out of my own way. Okay. So now what I have is I know what the depth is of all my stairs receding back in space. Maybe I'll make one more. Okay, maybe two. All right, so the next thing I need to do is measure and make my next stair that same height. So with your ruler, just go up and measure that out. And that feels maybe a little tall, because this should also be the same. All right. And then I can create my next one. And this is starting to flatten out. At least it would if I was being a little more careful. And let's keep repeating this process. Repeating this process. Like so. Okay. So now you'll see, actually, there is an implied diagonal up here. 1 and 2 point perspective assume that everything is operating in right angles on a flat plane. Anytime I get an inclined plane, I'm going to get another vanishing point that's up in the sky if it's ascending, or down on the ground if it is descending. So that's going to come in handy. But before I get too much into that, I'm just going to, oh dear. I'm just going to start to tip things going down. Okay, I added these extra steps. Now I'm skeptical. All right. Okay, so I only have about a minute left, which is not a lot of time. So I'm going to go through so fast. And see what I can do to just make this happen. Now, one of the things that I use to kind of cheat a little bit is I will figure out what these diagonals should be, and I can use those to help me figure out how to create my space. There we go. So we will revisit this next time, and thank you for all of your efforts. Great job.